Our time with the Fujifilm GFX 50S couldn't have been better. The company's first digital medium format camera is a beast in every sense of the word. It has a 51.4 megapixel sensor and is as bulky as most high-end DSLRs. Despite its size though, it doesn't feel heavy at all, and I would know it since I lugged it around every day without a shoulder strap. The 51.4 megapixel mirrorless sensor is large in many ways, especially when compared to something like a Micro Four Thirds or APS-C camera. We've seen some sensors with this kind of resolution before, but only on full-frame shooters like Canon's 5DS and 5DSR. I used it at South by Southwest for a week because we knew we'd run into a variety of scenarios, from low-light art installations to daylight street photography. The entire time I had to pair with a 63mm f2.8 lens. If that's not your style though, Fujifilm also has a 32 to 54mm and a 120mm lens, which costs $2,300 and $2,700 respectively. The 50S was such a blast to use and had very few if any shortcomings, and you shouldn't expect anything less considering that it's a $6,500 camera, plus the $1,500 you'd have to spend on the 63mm lens alone. The most impressive thing we noticed is how well it performed in low light situations, like when we took it into a dark room to check out digital art exhibits. It didn't struggle at all focusing on subjects, and the shots it produced were incredibly sharp even with high ISO levels. Not surprisingly, the same goes for daylight and well-lit situations. It helps that the 50S has great ergonomics too, thanks in large part to Fujifilm's trademark physical dials. In this case, there's one that lets you control the ISO and another for shutter speed. Along the top of the camera, next to the shutter dial, there's also a small LCD display, which is nifty and gives you a quick glance at your camera settings, like ISO, aperture, white balance, and more. As far as framing your shot goes, you can use either the high-res, OLED EVF, or the 3-inch LCD screen on the back. I tend to switch between both, depending on what kind of shot I'm taking. If I'm at an odd angle, for example, I'll use the articulating screen to get a better view of my subjects, especially when I'm trying to set a specific focus point with the joystick. It's also nice to use the touchscreen to zoom in on shots you've taken. You probably won't find yourself doing this often, but it was one of my favorite things to do. The more you zoom in, the more you realize how great the resolution of the 50S is. That's what happens when you have a 51.4 megapixel sensor. One of the art installations we checked out at South by Southwest was the Infinity Room, a digital exhibit that had hundreds of lights and sounds being projected at us. I took a picture in there that was so good that my colleague ended up using it as his Twitter profile photo. The camera's autofocus is fast and I had no trouble locking in on subjects in the Infinity Room, which had me basically shooting in the dark. Most of the shots I took in there came out with very little noise, and that was with me shooting at ISO 6400. The 50S can go up to 12,800, but I didn't have to push it that far. Part of the reason the shots were so sharp is Fujifilm's X Processor Pro. It's the same image processor that's on the company's flagship X Pro 2 and X-T2 shooters. While the camera supports most SD cards, you should probably use a high-speed one. Otherwise you may run into buffering issues. The high-resolution shots from the 51.4 megapixel sensor means your files are going to be massive. A RAW shot, for instance, can be around 120 megabytes, or between 15 and 20 if you go the JPEG route. I noticed the camera slowed down a bit after using continuous shooting mode or shooting a time-lapse, especially as I was trying to review the photos I'd taken. There are 2 SD card slots on the camera, since this is geared towards professionals after all. The 50S shoots video too, of course, but that's definitely not its strongest suit. The camera is limited to 1080p videos at up to 30 frames per second, and it's pretty disappointing that there's no 4K here, especially since that's a feature found on most digital cameras nowadays. Still, as with most Fuji cameras, photography is where the 50S really shines. Another important thing to keep in mind is battery. Fujifilm tried something different with the 50S and placed a battery slot on the side of the camera, rather than the bottom as we see with most other shooters. This should come in handy for photographers who want to mount it permanently on a tripod, as it'll be easy to swap power units. The battery life is rated at 400 shots, though that depends on whether you add some video into the mix. In my case, I never felt worried that the camera was going to die on me, and I didn't have to recharge it until after a couple of days of regular use, which included taking a couple hundred shots and using the touchscreen quite a bit to zoom in and review the shots I'd taken. As bulky as the battery is, it's only 1230 milliamps. The iPhone 7, for comparison, is around 2000 milliamps, which means camera makers should probably figure out a way to come up with better battery tech. Aside from the festival, Austin is a great city to find things to shoot, but you have to be ready to fire up your camera to catch certain moments. And not surprisingly, the 50S was up to the task. I would say I was happy with 95% of the shots I took, and was pleasantly surprised by how fast the camera's autofocus was. I never felt like the camera struggled to shoot right when I wanted it to, even in scenarios where you basically had to shoot in the dark. Outside the convention center, we had sunny, cloudy, and rainy days during our week here in Texas. And while the camera isn't waterproof, a few raindrops here and there won't hurt it. Just don't go crazy trying to submerge it underwater and you'll be just fine. I've used quite a few Fuji cameras in my day, and the thing I love the most about them is that I can just pick them up and point and shoot as I'm walking around. And the 50S is no different. I may not be the best photographer, but the 50S definitely made me feel like one. It's just sad that I probably won't own one anytime soon. The 50S obviously isn't for everyone, as it's designed for professional photographers. But it shows that Fuji is willing to push the envelope for digital cameras, especially those that are mirrorless. Don't be surprised if we start to see more companies explore with media format sensors. Let's just hope they'll keep getting cheaper.